Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the spending review for 2025. I guess it's one of the three really big things that we're going to have to deal with this year. Spending review giving us the overall quantum of funding for the public sector, but also for local government. Then we've got the big consultation paper on funding reform, which I understand is due within weeks. I suspect it'll be sometime later this month. And then, of course, the big event towards the end of the year. They're expecting the provisional settlement to be towards the end of November. My guess is it'll be in December. But they're kind of the big three landmark kind of announcements we've got to work with this year. The first one, spending review, we saw on Wednesday. In terms of what it's given us, is we already knew it would be a really tight settlement, and that a lot of the funding would be front loaded. We knew there'd be some real terms growth. It was about 1.2% real terms on average over the next 3 years, but as I said, mostly front loaded. The next spending review comes around in 2027, and I think there'll be some pressure to top up the funding allocations in 2028-29 at that point. So it's not the end of the story yet, but at least we know what for certain what we're going to get for the next 2 years. As I said, the settlement does look very tight for the public sector as a whole. And you can tell that because the Treasury has attempted to make the increases look more generous by using rather unorthodox methods for adding in earlier years in different places and just sort of generally muddying the waters. The NHS is the biggest winner. 60% of the increase in DEL goes to the NHS, even though its increase was about 5% cash, 2% growth per real terms per year. 60% of the increase goes to the NHS, but some departments, the IFS estimates 8 of them will see their departmental expenditure limits actually cut. So it's different in different parts of the public sector. Defence is another big winner. It's spending going up to 2.5% of GDP, 2.6% if you include the security services, but most of that is funded from capital rather than revenue. So in that sense, it's not affecting directly to the same degree as the NHS is the amount of funding that's available in revenue terms for local government. Funding for schools is still tight, and that represents a real terms freeze in funding for schools if you strip out the cost of expanding free school meals. So in this context, as we'll see, local government settlement is better than the average, but only if you include council tax increases. In terms of our summary, core spending power is going up 3.1% in real terms over that longer period of time. So it's I think that's the phase one period of time that the government's talking about. So there is some real terms increase within the settlement, but nevertheless, it's still, I think you could still characterize it as a tough settlement. It doesn't give the sector the funding that it needs, and it will result in smaller increase in funding than we've received in recent years. So on those two quite important measures, it's less good in the next 3 years than we've had in recent years. But it is nevertheless a better settlement than many other parts of the public sector are getting, even if those resources are largely the result of council tax increases rather than more grant funding. I think I must explore this in quite a bit of detail today. There's still a lot of uncertainty about the grant funding within core spending power, and also within that wider funding package. Government's talking about an additional £5 billion in grant funding, which we'll try and unpick. It's not quite as good as that, but there is some growth in grant funding. And I was on a call listening to what the local government minister, Jim McMahon, said yesterday, and he said that they were quite pleased with the settlement from the department's point of view because there was some growth in grant funding for the sector. I mean, he would say that, wouldn't he? That's what we'd expect him to say, but at least we can say there has been some increase in grant for local government. Average core spending power, just to illustrate how much different the increase in the future years will be compared to the recent past. The average increase in core spending power in cash terms between 1920 and 25-26 was about 6.9% cash, and that'll fall to around 4.5% cash average over the next 3 years. So there's a sizable reduction in the increase in core spending power, and of course all that's going to be further destabilized by the funding reforms in 26-27. So looking at the overall departmental expenditure limits, the DELs, You can see here, especially if you look at the real terms growth, the right-hand columns there, falling from an average of 1.9% in 26-27 down to 0.9% in 28-29. So you can see just how front-loaded the increases are in real terms in the departmental expenditure limits. And you can see there is going to be quite a lot of pressure there, I think, on the Chancellor to come back again and top up those increases certainly in 28-29, and I think as well in 27-28 as well. So it's pretty tight for the public sector as a whole. Real terms growth of only 1.2% real terms over the next 3 years. Looking at the historical context, you can see, I mean, again, you can see that the bottom bar on that chart, this is from the IFS, that shows you 23, 24 through to 28, 29. So that includes this year and the last couple of years as well of growth, where there were pretty strong increases in funding. So that's 2.3% annual real terms growth. For the next 3 years, as we see on the previous slide, it's 1.2% average, so quite a bit lower. And you can see what's happened in the recent past. You can see that particularly in that period 1920 to 23-24, spending was increasing pretty quickly, and local government got a very large share of that. So in that sense, we did pretty well out of, or the public sector as a whole had big increases in spending, partly driven by COVID, and we had a pretty good share of that. You can see as well in that memo the previous Conservative plans. So these are the previous government's pre-election plans, really tight settlements planned in there, 0.6% real terms growth. So as you know, in the last couple of budgets, the Chancellor has increased taxes and put more money into the plans for public spending. So they are going to be quite a bit better than they would have been based on the previous government's plans. Having said that, I'm pretty sure the previous government, had they come into power, they would have done pretty much the same thing. They would have increased spending as well. But I think one point I would make is that generally from the kind of that high point towards the start of this decade, I think we are going to see a gradual tightening of public spending over the decade. That's certainly what the plans imply, you know, from relatively large increases at the start of the decade through to much smaller ones towards the end. And then casting our minds further back, you can see just how bad things were, especially in that period from 9-10 to 14-15. You know, big real terms cuts in total departmental spending. The bad old days, as I'm sure many of us can remember. Then looking at overall departmental expenditure limits, this time these are in cash terms. So departmental expenditure limits increasing by 3.2% cash over the next 3 years. And as we know, the NHS is the clear winner from the spending review. It's got an overall increase of 30.5 billion by year 3. So that's 60% of the increase, the net increase in DEL, and averaging about 4.9% cash terms increase consistently over that period as well. So it's easily the biggest winner in terms of the amount of the DEL increase that's gone to the NHS. And then by my calculations, the non-NHS element of the Department of Health and Social Care's DEL is going down, average 2.7%, particularly in the first couple of years. That's not had that much press, but I think it's I think for us in particular, that's quite an important feature of the settlement, particularly for things like public health grant, which will be funded from that part of the budget. There's growth in education and schools, but it's only smallish real terms growth. And as we said, there are big pressures on that. On the school side, you know, new burdens around free school meals. On the wider education and school side, on things like the SEND deficit, that could easily consume that growth in funding for those services. It's interesting that the settlement for the Home Office is flat in cash terms, which implies real terms cuts. Of course, the police will get a real terms growth in their funding, but that's largely, well, it's almost entirely dependent on precept increases. So it's interesting that the Home Office got such a poor settlement. We've talked about increases in funding for defence, but they don't look particularly large on this chart because this is the DEL, the revenue side of things. Much of their increase is in capital investment, demonstrating that, you know, defence is much more of a capital investment, capitally intensive service. And then we see local government core spending power increasing by 4.5% on average. So you can see there that in relative terms, We're not doing as well as the NHS, but we're doing quite a bit better than the average public sector. But that depends on council tax increases, and that brings with it its own problems, which we'll discuss in a few slides' time. I love this chart from the Institute for Government. It doesn't beat around the bush in telling you who's winning and who's losing. But what it is interesting to see is what's happened to local government. For quite a lot of the previous, well, the past, local government didn't do that well. That spending review in 2010, I'm sure we remember, local government was pretty much at the bottom of the pack, and we didn't do that much better in 2015 either. But towards the start of this decade, the sector started to do a lot better. And as you can see, the IFG are saying that local government came out top of the pile in the 21 and 24 spending reviews. I think that's pretty much true. I think that demonstrated that the government realised the cuts in local government were too harsh and gave us much better settlements. Certainly those two spending reviews. We ranked third out of the main services in the 2025 spending review, but that's really because defence and health have really been singled out to have the best increases in funding, but local government doing better than all the rest. So in that sense, I think we can say that we've done very well in recent spending reviews, slightly less well in relative terms in 2025, but better than most services. Looking briefly at the capital allocations, you can see there just how big the increase in funding is for defence, by far the biggest over the next 3 years, followed by energy and net zero. So that's really, Ed Miliband's department, a really big increase there as well. The kinds of capital increases that would affect local government around housing and around transport, largish but quite a bit smaller. So not particularly well favoured on the capital side. And I think you could also say that the kind of increases in capital investment that are focused on growth type items are relatively small. Defence has taken the lion's share, followed by what you might call net zero related capital investment. So let's look now at the local government core spending power numbers. There's so many different numbers expressed in different ways over different years. It's in cash and real terms. It's hard to pull out exactly the things that are important, but there's one line in the red book that you can trust, which is the core spending power cash increases over the next 3 years. That's in table 5.3. So you can see there the core spending power increasing from the figure we know now, 69.4 billion. Then rising up to 79.3, an increase of 9.9 billion. I'm assuming they're the figures we can trust, and they're the figures that we've used and based our forecasts on. So then we haven't got a split of how that splits between council tax and grant. We've assumed that council tax increases by an average of 6.2% over the next 3 years. So assuming broadly full increase in Band D compared to the thresholds and some tax-based growth as well. We've just used the previous 2 years average growth in council tax to do that. So that's our assumption. So that generates £7.5 billion worth of extra council tax revenues, leaving about £2.3 billion worth of grant increases. Different ways of doing that. But talking to the IFS and talking to the LGA, they've got a similar approach to us and have come up with similar-ish sort of figures. So at least there's consistency there in terms of how people are interpreting the funding that's available for local government. But what that suggests is that most of the increase in funding in core spending power is coming from council tax. Our estimate is that over the next 3 years, it accounts for 76% of the increase. I think the IFS's figures over 80%, but it's similar sort of ballpark. Then if we then look at what that grant funding looks like over the next 3 years, that suggests 1.4 billion in 26-27, 388 million in 27-28, and 533 million in 28-29. The numbers will be slightly different, but it shows you around 2.3 billion with the bulk of that increase in the first year. So we can see there as well, in terms of the overall increases, you can see there 4.5% average increase in cash terms in core spending power, and that translates into a 2.7% real terms increase in core spending power as well over the period. I think the figure in the red book is 2.6% real terms growth, but we're pretty much on the same page there. So that's how we see the numbers breaking down. There is an issue there with that number, as I said, the 2.3 billion. There are different approaches to get to that figure. You will have seen as well in the red book that the government talks about a 3.4 billion pound increase in grant within core spending power over the 4-year period 25-26 to 28-29. The difficulty with that approach is that there was an increase in grant funding within core spending power of 1.9 billion of more than 1.9 billion rather in 25-26, said that the numbers don't quite work out on that basis. So there are different ways of doing it, and there is a little bit of uncertainty, but for now we're going to stick with our interpretation of the numbers, which is let's look at the published figures for core spending power and a reasonable increase in the council tax revenues over the next 3 years and proceed on that basis. But just recognise that we don't know for certain what that grant funding figure is yet within core spending power. So implications for local government funding. The increase in core spending power is higher than the average increase in DEL, 4.5% for ourselves in core spending power in local government. The average increase in DEL, 3.2% cash over the period as well. But as we've seen, growth is reliant on council tax increases and it is front loaded. So that puts a lot of reliance on that council tax growth, which in turn puts pressure on you as individual authorities to agree, for your members to approve effectively above inflation increases in Band D, and that comes on the back of a number of years of above inflation increases in Band D. So members are going to be cautious about doing that. But because the increase in core spending power is so reliant on council tax, that does, and we know the distribution of council tax revenues is very uneven across the country. That means that the increases in core spending power over the next 3 years are going to be very partly driven by council tax increases, and that in turn will put more pressure, I think, on ministers to do more equalisation up front. Obviously, the biggest factor in affecting the distribution of funding over the next 3 years are going to be funding reforms in 26-27, but over the 3 years, the growth in council tax will have a really big impact on that distribution of core spending power growth. So I think that'll put more pressure on the government to do more equalisation up front or even over the period as well. I think there may potentially be more funding announced at some point, particularly towards the later years. Again, this is a comment that Jim McMahon made yesterday, which is around this is the floor, not the ceiling for the settlement, which suggests there is potentially more to come. So some kind of funding top up, and I think especially for social care, as we'll see, the funding for social care is particularly low compared to previous years. So we still need to clarify quite a few important things. We need to clarify the grant funding that's within core spending power, how much it is and what it's for. Also the grant funding that's outside core spending power, and also whether there's any additional funding for transitional support outside the core spending power that will be used to help dampen and phase in some of the funding reform changes in 26-27. I think on the day itself, we were concerned about whether they'd taken into account the surplus from the baseline reset and retained business rates income. I'm pretty sure they haven't now, but we do need to know what's going to happen to that, the funding from that reset. In terms of council tax, no change in the main thresholds. So a maximum 3% core increase, 2% adult social care precept, effectively no change in those headline increases. But we didn't get any confirmation about the specific thresholds for shire districts, fire authorities, or police. They're not specified anywhere in the statement. We assume they remain at £5 for districts and fire and £14 for police, but we don't know that yet. As I mentioned, the assumptions we've used are based on the average increase in council tax yield over the previous 2 years, 6.2%, which assumes most councils applying the maximum increase and tax-based growth of around 1.3%. So the increases in spending power, both in local government and in police, are largely reliant on growth in council tax yield. So let's look now at adult social care funding. The spending review promises an additional £4 billion by year 3, with some coming from the NHS's minimum contribution, some coming from funding, grant funding, and some coming from the precept. We estimate that the precept will generate about an additional £1.8 billion by 28-29. So it's about £600 million of additional income per year. So that suggests there's about 2.2 billion in funding, either from the NHS contribution or from specific grants. We understand that the NHS will be told to increase their contribution to social care in line with their increases in funding, which is about 5% per year. So their overall funding contribution is about 5.6 billion. So that translates into about 260 million pounds extra a year, or about 840 million by year 3. So that suggests, if those numbers are correct, that would require about 1.4 billion pounds worth of additional social care grant within the core spending power. If that's the case, that would consume the bulk of any of that increase in grant funding within core spending power. And of course, there are other things that would need to be funded within by local authorities in terms of social care, the fair pay agreement for social care staff, and also the potential cost of any funding reforms following the Casey review. And that could be the point at which government does put more money into the system. So just looking at the social care grants here, and looking at about what's happened since we first started getting social care grants in 17-18, the average increase since then has been £1 billion, just over £1 billion. So that we've had some big increases in social care funding over the recent past. And some of the biggest increases have been very, very recent, 23, 24, 24, 25. That was because they cancelled the care funding, the care charge reforms, and put all the money into grant funding for local authorities. So you can see that if we assume there's £1.4 billion over the next 3 years, and it's front loaded, an assumption might be that there's £700 million of additional social care grant in 26-27, and then £350 million in the following 2 years. That's for illustration purposes. We don't know, but that kind of fits in with what the Red Book's been telling us. So 700 million would be reasonably high compared to most other previous years, 23, 24, and 24, 25 sticking out as real outliers, but that would be pretty much in line with what we've seen in recent years. 350 per year would be way towards the bottom end, and in fact, if it was 350 million pounds for those 2 years, they would be the smallest increases in grant for social care that we've had since 17-18, so they would be pretty low. We've done some wider analysis for social care funding, and we think that with that kind of increase and with a 2% social care precept, that would result in social care resources increasing by about 4.8% per year, compared with the average 10.3% that we've had since 2020. So, quite a big reduction in the increase, about half the increase in social care resources in the next 3 years as you've had in the last 5. So that's going to put more pressure on social care services. So now this knotty question about what's actually included within the grants within core spending power. So if we assume that our initial calculations are right, and there is 2.3 billion pounds of grant funding over the next 3 years, what might that be used for? So we think it would need to be used for 1.4 billion pounds worth of additional funding for social care. See the previous slide for further discussion around that. The LGA think that, or they would assume that some of it would be available to index settlement funding assessment. That would cost around 340 million pounds a year, but I think their view probably is now that there's possibly not enough within the settlement to do that. But that has been an expectation in the settlement since at least 2020. We've also been told, I understand, that some of the funding's for transitional support, so to help damp the changes in the funding reforms in 26-27, but we don't know how much. And I'd have thought as well that some of it would be funded from either outside core spending power or by top slicing the growth in funding in other parts of the sector. And also we understand that some of the children's social care transformation fund is funded within core spending power as well. Clearly not all of this can be funded from that 2.3 billion, so there'll need to be choices about what is and what isn't funded. But those choices do have quite significant distributional consequences. For districts and fire, for instance, if there's no indexation of SFA, then that means these types of authorities will get very, very little of that increase in, or possibly none of the increase in grant funding, unless you're getting transitional support. So it could be that the increase in grant funding is very much focused on social care authorities. Potentially some of that is for funding reforms, but obviously the beneficiaries from that will be only those authorities that are losing out from the funding reforms. There are also, of course, new burdens and ongoing pressures as well. So how does the additional funding sort of split between funding some of those new burdens around social care, children's social care, and how much can you use to fund your ongoing pressures? We'll update the model early next week and change some of the assumptions to reflect what's happened in the spending review. Of course, you can change them yourself if you wish, but I'm minded, I think, to put these kinds of changes through in terms of the overall the grant side of things. The council tax we won't change at all. There's no indication that we need to at this point. But in terms of that £2.3 billion of additional grant funding, I think we'll put through the £1.4 billion increase in social care grant that we calculated with that front loaded in that phasing you see there. Let's put, I think, half of the £500 million of the Children's Transformation Fund in 26-27, I should say. So £250 million in 26-27, and then the remainder would be £700 million for transitional support in 26-27, and no increase in SFA or cap compensation. So for SFA, we continue to apply a 0% cash freeze to that. Cap compensation, I think, will fall away anyway, so it's not. I don't think that'll be a relevant sum. So that's how we think, or that's how we're going to model it for, in our update next week. We don't know any of that for certain yet, but based on what the Red Book says, I think they're reasonable modelling assumptions to take into your budget planning. So the wider local government grant funding, as I mentioned earlier on, this is confirmed as well in an email from Eric CLG. The spending review provides £5 billion of new grant funding for local government, but that includes the 3.4 billion, which, as we know, includes the uplift in 25-26 as well. But there are some other specific sums here. So there's 760 million to reform the current SEND system. There's some contribution from the NHS through the Better Care Fund. We estimated 860 million, 500 million for the Transformation Fund, on top of the new Children's Social Care Prevention grant in the settlement this year, a one-off amount of 100 million for homelessness prevention, and a one-off amount of 100 million to support adults with complex needs. If you top those up, that comes to more than 5 billion. So there's something going on there. There's certainly some other grants that we'll get outside core spending power. I think we need to find out more about what they are before we start relying on those numbers. So looking at core spending power in context of what's happened over previous years, you can see there, first of all, how bad things were from 2010 to about 2019, 2020. But then in recent years, things have been relatively good in cash terms and largely in real terms as well. If we use the GDP deflator to calculate real terms changes, we've had real terms growth in every year. The smallest growth was in 22-23, only 0.6% real terms. But the cash uplift that year was 7.7%, 10.1% cash uplift in 23-24. The next 3 years, as we know, we'll expect to see both healthy cash increases and reasonable real terms increases as well, but they will be smaller increases than we've been used to for most of the last 5 or 6 years. As I said, average increase since 1920, 6.9%, and the average increase in cash terms, and over the next 3 years, we're looking at 4.5%. So it's quite a big reduction in that growth rate. And then if we track that in cumulative terms over that period, by our estimation, core spending power will be 40.8% higher in cash terms in 28-29 than it was in 2010-11, but it won't have got back up to that same mark in real terms by 28-29. We estimate it will still be about 4.1% below where it was in 2010 in real terms. So we still haven't fully caught up yet with all those huge cash terms cuts in funding in the last decade. Funding for police and fire, 2.3% real terms for police. So that's much better than for the Home Office overall, where funding's effectively flat in cash terms over that period. It's a slightly smaller average increase than for local government, but as we said, largely funded from the police precept. There's no specific mention at all of the funding for fire. Fire's not mentioned once in the document. And to some degree, that kind of reflects what we've seen in recent settlements, where where the funding for fire seems to have been almost an afterthought, really, in the way that they put the settlement together and not really considered and given the priority that it needs really within the settlements. There's no mention at all of what the funding will be. Obviously, the fire authorities and the fire function will be funded from within the local government finance settlement, so it will be affected by the funding reforms, the overall quantum, but also reflecting what we saw on a previous slide, that there's likely to be very little grant funding increase for fire authorities, and increases are likely to be largely reliant on the precept increase of the higher of 2.99 or 5%, £5, but that's not confirmed yet. So looking at the funding reforms, in our view, they'll be much more difficult to deliver with the limited increases in overall funding that we're seeing over the next 3 years. And obviously, we need to put that in context. The increases are lower than we've had in the recent 3, 4, 5 years, but they're better than most parts of the public sector, and there is still some money to play with. I posed a couple of questions here about, do we think that it means that MHCLG will have to scale back its ambition for redistribution? Will they have to extend the period over which the reforms are implemented? To be honest, I don't think so. I think it makes it harder to implement big changes in distribution when growth in funding is relatively low. But I think the fact that they put in potentially such a largish amount for transitional support suggests that they're going to go full speed ahead with the kind of reforms that they were looking at anyway. And I think the fact that the future settlements are so reliant on increases in council tax, I think just probably increases the justification for ministers to actually do more aggressive equalisation, either in 26, 27, or even over the whole 3-year period. So I don't think this spending review gives any indication that ministers will try and scale back what they're trying to do. I do think that they'll need more transitional support funding, but that could be achieved in various different ways. Scaling back gains is one, as well as putting in specific funding up front. There's some interesting stuff around the simplification of the settlement. They're still very keen on doing it, and they're still committed to multi-year settlements, but we didn't see any of it in the spending review, which is slightly disappointing. Did pick up some comments though, generally about what that simplification might look like, and it might have greater scope than I'd previously expected. I think MHCLG is looking at to consolidate a huge amount of Whitehall spending, about 300 budget lines, about £12.7 billion in value that's spread across different departments, and consolidating those into potentially 2 different pillars with more flexibility to move money around. I don't know what that looks like, but that suggests potentially that could be a really big change in the way the sector's funded. And I think ministers also are seeing that sort of local government reorganisation, unitarisation programme as something similar, giving unitary councils more flexibility to move money up and down and around than you get in the current 2-tier system. So that's clearly what they're looking at. In terms of the reform consultation, the phrase was only weeks away, which could be any time between now and the recess. I'm sure it will be in June. I understand the consultation paper. Some people will get to see it next week, so it's pretty close to being finalised, and I suspect it will be within a couple of weeks max. They're still looking at a provisional settlement in late November, but I think they recognise just how difficult that might be. And I think personally, although it's good, it would be good to have a settlement in late November rather than late-ish December. I think given the scale of change they're coping with, I'd be very surprised if they did get anything out before the end of November. I think we're still looking at the same sort of timing as we've been used to over the last 10 years, i.e. the last week before Christmas. A few other final things before I hand it over to Dan. First is about SEND funding. So it was disappointing that there was no announcement about the SEND deficits in the spending review. The IFS referred to it as a looming challenge, which we all know very well. We understand that the funding for local government will be addressed in the funding reform consultation paper later this month. And in terms of reforming the whole system, that'll be in a white paper around schools and SEND in the autumn. So it's kind of been kicked down the road a little bit. We understand negotiations are still ongoing between the Treasury, DfE, and MHCLG. And everyone's alive to the scale of the problem, which I think is obviously, as we know, is huge. IFS analysis shows that without action, the increase in the SEND deficit could wipe out all the increase in schools funding. So it's obviously a present danger to the schools funding system. And I think, from what I understand, ministers realise they can't leave councils with a cliff edge. So something's going to happen. It's just disappointing that they haven't said anything in the spending review. Very quickly looking at devolution and the integrated settlements. Another announcement on that, and expanding from the current membership of that group, Greater Manchester and West Midlands, out to include the North East, West Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, Liverpool City region, and now I think London's the latest one to be included in this integrated settlement programme. So some interesting things about how it will work for local authorities, that it doesn't include any funding streams that directly underpin local statutory and/or core responsibilities or funding for national transport schemes. But otherwise, the idea is that these integrated settlements include funding that falls into all the themes where the mayoral strategic authorities have functional responsibilities. So it's things like economic development, transport, adult skills, etc. And then there's some interesting more technical detail about how the settlements will work, how they get paid, what the accountability framework looks like, and that kind of thing. But it's interesting stuff, I think, and kind of points to the future of how the wider local government family will be funded. Looking at transport and infrastructure, obviously it's an important priority for the government, although there were cuts in the revenue funding for transport, which is interesting, as we saw the increases in funding for transport from capital were relatively small compared to defence and net zero. But some interesting transport schemes were announced, some of them national, the Transpennine route upgrade and the East-West corridor from Oxford and Cambridge, and more funding going via local authorities, particularly via mayors. So 15.6 billion for elected mayors for the largest cities via the Transport City Region settlement, and then 2.3 billion in the local transport grant for local authorities for various schemes over the period. Some other funding issues which I think are important. First one about public health grant. I think those cuts in the non-NHS element of the Department of Health and Social Care, DEL, suggests that there won't be any additional funding for public health. So at the moment in our modelling, we're assuming cash flat for public health over the period. And I think that's probably about the best we can hope for that public health grant. Changes in household support fund, which I know for many of you is a really important factor. It's going to be replaced by the Crisis and Resilience Fund, and there'll be funding of £1 billion within that fund. That compares to 742 million in the household support fund in the current year, and it will include funding for discretionary housing payments. So I don't know enough about those funding streams to know whether that £1 billion is effectively a cut in that fund, and it kind of indicates that it might be, but I don't know that for sure. Need to do some more work there. The income streams for extended producer responsibility will continue into 26-27. The guarantee ends in the current financial year. So that scheme looks like that will continue as planned. There was a comment in there about it continuing to be in the local government finance settlement, which, as we know, it's not formally within the settlement at all, but there have been talks about that being those income streams forming some part of the baseline for the settlement going into 26-27. But the fact that it's variable income rather than grant funding suggests to me you can't put it in the settlement and it has to stay outside it. And then housing and homelessness mentioned, the one-off £100 million funding for the transformation fund. Final slide looking at just the financial sustainability, and I think my overall takeaway would be that although the funding for the sector from core spending power gives us a higher than average increase in DEL than compared to other parts of the public sector, it's still a challenging settlement for the sector. The increases in resources will be a lot lower than we've been used to in recent years, and there's no indication that spending pressures will be growing any less quickly. So I think the crunch on resources is going to be even harder to handle in the next 3 years than it's been in the recent past. And then on top of that, the funding reforms will create some really severe funding pressures in some authorities in 26-27 and really over the whole period. So maybe a third of authorities will experience some really severe pressures as arising from those funding reforms. So those authorities will need to know much more about the transitional support, the timescales, how much will be available, the pace of change. Really, really important for those authorities. And obviously some non-core spending power funding is really important as well, particularly around SEND deficits. They need to tell us what's going on as quickly as possible, with the override ending at the end of, I think it's the end of this financial year. So there's, some really important announcements that we need to know about there. And then finally, exceptional financial support. It's likely to be a lot more widely used within the sector over the coming years, and combined with the pressure to increase council tax as well. And it might be that council tax is the safety valve that the government try to use if you're struggling, in terms of, because of the funding reforms, or struggling because of other spending pressures. My guess is that council tax increases could be the safety valve that ministers turn to allow councils to get themselves out of the problem to some degree. So that's kind of the overall and fairly depressing kind of conclusion from the whole announcement this week. Better than most parts of the public sector, but not good enough to stave off the really serious financial problems that we've got. Okay, Dan, I think it's over to you now. Yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Adrian. Morning, everybody. So that last slide was a really good link into what I'm going to take you through, which is a very initial look at what the balance sheets are looking like in 24-25. So if we move on one, Adrian, it is a very initial look, and partially because only 21 sets of accounts, so that's wrong, I should say 21, not 16. 10 upper tier authorities and 11 districts have released their draft accounts for 24-25. So it's a small look and a small number, and I'd be slightly cautious about some of the conclusions drawn because it is a small number. But actually, when I look at it, there's some really clear, even in the small number of accounts, some really clear trends that are coming out, which I expect to continue as more and more release. It is small. We did a couple of unscientific surveys, including one at last session did with Adrian, where we asked people if they thought they were going to publish by the 31st of May. And from that, I took that about 10 or 15% would. Well, only about 5% did by 31st of May, with a couple percentage points more since then. And I don't know why that is. I've spoken to a number of people. IFRS 16 was a bit of a pest, apparently. Not necessarily very technical, but lots of information you had to get together in order to do that. But a lot of people are just saying they wanted the time and have needed the time just to sit back, reflect, look at the accounts, do them proper justice. So they're not rushing just to get them published by a deadline. So it'll be interesting on the next couple of weeks to see how many more published. And then I'm expecting on Monday the 30th there's been an absolute flurry. I do think most authorities now intend to publish by 30th of June. Last year, 31% hit the 31st of May deadline. I reckon that'll be closer to 85-90% this time, I'm guessing, unless a lot of you tell me differently. So if we move on one, let's get into some of what these first accounts are telling us. So this slide is the upper tier, and imagine if all the upper tier authorities that have published to date became a new super unitary authority. It's the aggregate of those 10 upper tier authorities, and it's the balance sheet in aggregate. So you can see some interesting trends here at upper tier. Interesting, but perhaps not surprising. Picking those out, Adrian's already talked about schools. Well, school balances are deteriorating. They have for 3 or 4 years now. But the big one is the DSG deficit account. That has more than doubled in aggregate. And in actual fact, with the exception of 1 or 2, it's doubled everywhere. And the 10 that have published so far, they're a real mix. Those some areas that have quite low levels of deficit, the odd county, the odd sort of rural unitary area, which have high levels, but pretty much across the board, whatever level you're at, your DSG deficit's doubled. And I do wonder if the government really has got a handle on the impact of that. It's not just the deficit in its own right, but it's all of the impact on things like borrowing, internal borrowing, etc. But you'll also see that usable revenue reserves have reduced. quite significantly, and that'll be the 3rd consecutive year of reduction. And all of this adds up, the DSG deficits particularly, and the usable reserves, to mean that resources are getting squeezed. Balance sheets are shrinking at upper tier, and it's the third year that they've shrunk. So if we move on, let's have a look at districts, which is a very different picture. So there are 11 districts that published so far, and almost contrary to the upper tier, usable reserves have increased quite significantly. And they have at most of those 11 districts, as we'll see in a bit. So there's a lot more cash still swirling around at upper tier. Now that might be because business rates is districts tend to do better out of business rates, have done traditionally from new homes bonus, so they're tending to put more money in reserves. But we know from what Adrian's already told us and what we've already heard, districts that are in for a bit of a bashing, I suspect, at the when the funding review comes out. So it's not surprising that reserves are a little bit higher in districts, but quite an opposite picture to what you see in the upper tier. And if you move on another one, Adrian, let's just have a look a little bit individually. So usable revenue reserves, upper tier on the left, districts on the right. You can see there's a real difference there. This is in cash terms for those authorities that have published. So it's just the 5 years of the authorities that have published so far. And you can see a third consecutive year of reductions for the upper tier, and inching up slightly at district level. That's in cash terms. So in real terms, if you take core spending power as the denominator, you're looking at double figure percentage increases at upper tier for the third year running. So not a particularly bright picture for those of you that work for upper tier authorities. If we move on, another one. What's really interesting to me is upper tier reserves reduced during that period when core spending power went up the most. Adrian's already said that in the last 5-6 years it's gone up an average of 6.9. It's due to go up by 4.5. But during the better years of that 6.9, reserves have reduced. That says to me that the cost pressures, the demand pressures, have grown at a much faster rate than even those large CSP increases. Now, if those cost demand pressures continue to rise at that rate and CSP drops, then it could be fairly disastrous, particularly for upper tier. And then districts have got to worry about the resets and the hit to funding that they might get, which will, I'm suspecting, have a real impact upon their reserves going forward. Let's move on to dedicated school grants. Oh, sorry, no, just one last one, usable revenue reserves. That's the authorities that come out. You can see there, almost without exception, upper tier authorities individually have leaked reserves, and with a couple of exceptions, district reserves are going up. Last year, district reserves, about half came down, half went up. Whether those that have got their accounts out earlier are more likely to be in better financial shape, I'm not sure. It might be that as more come up, there'll be more with reduced reserves. It's not clear. We'll know more 30th of June. But let's get into dedicated school grants next, I think. Yes. So this is the biggie, isn't it? And it's the one that you really have to ask the question, does the government have a real handle on this? It's a little bit caught between two departments, MHCLG and Department for Education. But what you have here is ever accelerating, ever increasing deficit balances. So the 10 authorities that have released accounts, they're a good mix. There's lots of authorities that I know have massive DSG deficits and they still haven't released their accounts. So it's not as if we've got the 10 worst. I think they're fairly representative of the population, and virtually without exception, their DSG deficits doubled in 24-25. So last year, collectively, they were just under £2 billion. If it carries on at this rate, you're looking at closer to £4 billion. I think ALAT's in their survey thought about £3 billion, rising up to £8 or £9 billion, all things being equal, in 5-6 years' time. But this sort of backs that up with real information. DSG deficits are a bit of a crisis issue. And as Adrian's already pointed out, slightly disappointing, not really any mention other than kicking this onto the funding review. So I guess those of you that work in upper tier will anxiously be awaiting what provisions the government make in the funding review for SEN deficits. If we move on, we'll show you the sort of magnitude. So if you take the graph on the left here, shows again for those 10 authorities the DSG deficit added to usable revenue reserves, and you can see there that there's, you know, what, another 2, 3, 4 years at that run rate. In aggregate, those authorities will have no reserves if once, you know, assuming the DSG override is finished. The rate of decline is heading at a fairly rapid rate towards the origin there, so that's not good. And I think the top right graph shows that as a proportion of core spending power, every single one of those 10 authorities has seen their usable reserves and DSG balances collectively reduce. I think when we get 151 authorities, you will see no more than 3, 4, 5 where it's increased. You might not even see that. I think this is a pattern that you'll see pretty much across the board. And that, for me, at the bottom right one's really telling, because if you take the DSG deficit and work it as a proportion, a percentage of the level of usable reserves, you've got usable reserves coming down, DSG deficits going up. It's almost exponentially increasing now, isn't it? For those 10 authorities, almost a third of their level of usable reserves is the level of DSG deficit. That in itself is not good, but if you look at the speed at which that's grown in the last 5 years, that would say we're 2 or 3 years away if there isn't a good intervention by government from deficits overwhelming balance sheets completely, which is pretty grim reading. So let's move on to another subject, and that's debts. And I think that's where there is a link back to falling reserves and increasing deficits. Because what we're seeing is the need to borrow is going up about 7% in cash terms for those 10 authorities, expectedly not dissimilar for all 150 at upper tier. That's kind of a real terms treading water. It's not really going up massively in real terms because CSP went up by similar amounts in that particular year. But at the upper tier, all of that increase in the need to borrow, all of it was funded in aggregate by external borrowing. And on top of that, there's a slight switch out of existing levels of internal borrowing. So the external borrowing is not only an increase, is funding increases in capital expenditure, it'll be funding DSG deficits, it will be funding exceptional financial support, and it'll be replacing internal borrowing where internal resources are reducing and authorities can no longer sustain their internal borrowing levels, so they're having to externalise their borrowing. So short-term borrowing, particularly because long-term borrowing is really expensive at the moment, isn't it, has ramped up massively, and I'd expect that to continue as more and more authorities release their accounts, and that manifests in a massive increase in interest payable. You know, a quarter as much again in interest payable in 1 year is a significant and arguably unsustainable increase in interest payable. But I think we'll see more of this as we go along, and if nothing is done, more authorities will not be able to sustain their internal borrowing. More external borrowing will happen at short-term rates, subject to interest rate volatility. More interest will be payable, and budgets that aren't kind of shrinking anyway are going to have this extra financial pressure on top of that. If we go to the districts, which is the next slide, again, you see the opposite. So the need to borrow increased similarly, but it's pretty much entirely funded from internal borrowing. In fact, external borrowing has reduced for those 11 districts that have published. So because there's more cash in the system, there's more reserves, there's more treasury management flexibility, that districts have not yet been forced to externalise their borrowing. There's enough cash swelling in the system that any extra need to borrow is absorbed by internal borrowing. So they're not as exposed to interest rate volatility. I should say both, I'm seeing interest receivable going down for both types of authority. That's a function of two things, isn't it? There's less cash around because it tends to be that reserves are reducing, DSG deficits are going up, but also there are 3 quarter point interest rates cuts during the 24-25 years. So there's less interest being received on the same amount of cash balances, but there isn't the same amount of cash balances, they're reducing as well. So interest receivable is going down. And that, for some authorities, has been a real windfall gain in the last few years. That's starting to ebb away, and will probably continue to do so if rates still go down and balance sheets get squeezed for cash. Moving on then, so capital financing requirement very quickly. It's gone up, it's edged up, it's not gone up particularly massively anywhere. But if we look at the next slide, the real problem is it's not so much the capital financing requirement going up, it's the resources on the balance sheet that are available to internally borrow and internally finance that additional need to borrow. They're dropping the upper tier, forcing the upper tier into more external borrowing at higher and more volatile rates. And I think those current resources have, they would have dropped more has it not been for usable capital reserves. So government monies, Section 106 monies that sit on the balance sheet and the cash is on the balance sheet will have to be used at some point, but actually are propping up the cash position of some upper tier authorities. And I've spoken to one or two who said, yeah, the government gave us some highways money a bit early, so that's enabled us not to have to externalise our borrowing. But as soon as we have to do that highways work and that money leaves the balance sheet, we'll immediately have to externally borrow. So there's a real pressure there, and I think that's one of the biggest pressures that I can see in terms of financial vulnerabilities. It's not only the fact that reserves are depleting and deficits are going up for DSG, the combination of that means that there's less cash on the balance sheet, and therefore there's a lot more external borrowing at a time when rates are volatile. So I think that takes us to the conclusions, which last slide, which is everything I've just said. So real stress at upper tier, less so at districts, foreign reserves, increasing deficits, increasing pressure on capital, particularly on borrowing and external borrowing. And therefore, ahead of the announcements, I think, and I'd be interested to know what you all think at upper tier and districts, it feels like that there's a real vulnerability, particularly upper tier, ahead of any funding announcement that comes over the next few weeks. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Great stuff, Dan. Thank you. Brilliant. Spot on 11 o'clock. Thanks very much. If anyone needs to go, thanks for coming along. But we'll be around for another half an hour just for discussion and questions and answers and all that sort of thing. So thanks for coming along. So Dan, it's that's got a bit depressing in the end, doesn't it? It seems to be the case of
sorry about that.
Yeah. A couple of questions coming up though. I'll take actually Susan Roberts from Westmoreland, a question about what we've assumed for average council tax using projections. I've just used I think you should use the increase in yield without the one-off increase for second homes premium, and I'm pretty sure they will exclude that. I think. I mean, they may not exclude it from the core spending power numbers, possibly, but certainly in terms of equalisation, I'd assume that we'll strip out the second home premium income that's come through. They certainly won't be equalising that, but it's a good point about whether they actually take it out of the numbers for core spending power. I've just used an average 6.2% increase in council tax to do that.
I think they can't they, Adrian? Because if you look at the CTR that they used, I think second homes, I think you can get the second homes figures, because when I looked at that, I forget now, it's a few months ago, we could definitely see the impact of second homes by themselves. So I think the mechanism allows them to exclude it for purpose of equalisation. Whether they'll I think they might put them in the core spending power figures, however.
Yeah, I mean they ought to, and I think they will do. And I think also, Susan, the numbers just haven't settled down yet, so they're going to be moving around quite a bit for a year or two yet. Ben, question about the assumption for increase in SFA. What I meant, no cash increase, so cash flat. So assuming that it doesn't change, there's no indexation at all it's just flat in cash terms is what I'll assume. It's what I've had to date in the model, and I'm going to stick with that as well for now at least. I think that's reasonable. I'll talk to the LG a bit more about that, about what they think about it, and whether they will put any increase through, or expecting any increase, or whether there could be any funding somewhere else in the MHCLG's budgets to do that. I don't think there is, but I'm certainly going for the cash flat for now. The Nick question about is the 4.1% real terms shortfall against 2010 inflation adjusted, or just inflation adjusted? And it is. I've made adjustments for function, I've made adjustments for inflation, but I've not made any adjustment for population or demand growth. So as you say, it's down by 4.1% real terms over that period, and then as further shortfall for population growth, demand growth, etc. So clearly it's way below what the actual spending profile would have been that you've experienced. Pardon me. And that second question from Nick about if they release the consultation early, will there be any exemplifications of the financial impact? I understand there will be something, Nick. I think they're going to allow some representatives to see a hard copy of the paper next week, and that there will be, I think, needs shares within that. I don't know exactly what form that will take or how easy it'll be to model what the impact is based on that. I think the idea is that when we see the consultation paper later this month, that there's enough information in it to be able to model the outcomes. But let's see. I mean, they're talking about needs shares and that kind of thing. I don't know what that means. I think there'll be something in there, but whether it's enough or not, it's never enough, is it? There are always gaps. You always want to know more, but I think they'll try and give us something at least, Nick.
But you say, Adrian, don't you, that it's the resources, often say the resources equalisation that will cause some massive swings. Yeah. So it's that they really also need to show the degree to which they're doing that, plus then the transitional arrangements. I've spoken to a number, particularly districts, who are expecting to need transitional arrangements. The speed at which they do that and the extent to which they do it is going to be really important. And that, for me, it's really good that they're doing a 3-year settlement, because it brings some sort of form of stability. But there's no stability, is there, if you don't get to know what that looks like until settlement day? There's got to be something ahead of settlement day which allows you all to write your MTFSs and write your budget reports in autumn, having some clue as to what it's going to look like. Yeah,
exactly. Dan, there's unless they're going to give us the full thing, there'll always be gaps in our understanding, which it'll be more important for some rather than others. But at least if we do get some needs shares or some exemplifications of shares for the main service blocks, at least that starts to give us the opportunity to narrow down what the variables are that we don't know. So if we can understand more about what the likely shares are of, say, adult social care, children's social care, highways, foundation formula, then at least we can start to understand what authority's share of the needs assessment will be. And then we can say, well, okay, if the needs assessment's this size and the resources adjustments that size, what does that look like? But yeah, you're right. We'll unless you know everything, you don't know anything. That's part of the problem. And just going to Martin's point there about publishing by the end of June. I mean, I was surprised when they were so confident about publishing straight after the spending review, but I think they're very committed to doing that. And I think we will. I'm pretty sure we will have some consultation paper to look at before the end of the month. That's certainly the strong indication that they're giving. So, I mean, pull me up on that later, but I'm certainly expecting something, maybe even the week after next, to be honest, fairly soon. Jonathan, about the household support fund, just reading that, I think what you're saying there, and these funds better than I do, I think, that it seems like the funding there is no change. There's no change in the funding. They're just rebranding it. Tell me if I'm wrong on that, but that seems to be what you're saying there. That seems to be the case. Shailesh, about the LGR. I think there's a couple of questions there about it. Yeah, nothing mentioned about Surrey for the LGR. I think that'll be held back until I didn't see anything about LGR at all, really. And I think we're gonna have to wait until we know what the answer is there. Some announcement later in the year. I don't know. I don't know what the timing is for that, Shailesh. I think they're the kinds of things where cards are kept very close to their chest until ministers actually make an announcement. They're not extending the deadline for LGR business cases where they need to put in on the 20th of November. That's not being delayed. They're holding firm on that. So if you want the other two tier areas, that's still the deadline. Yeah, Michael, thanks for that about the LGR. It's such a conundrum. It is very difficult to handle. They're claiming that they've got the programs integrated, but I think that they're so unpredictable. All these programs with LGR in there as well. I think the only thing that's good, and it's not in the spending review, but something I picked up more widely, is I don't think they're taking into account any potential local government reorganisation savings as part of the spending review or as part of the overall programme. So that's a relief at the very least. Then Peter, there's never really a breakdown included at the local government resource del. Stuart says we should ask for it, and maybe we will ask for it and see if we get anything. But I've never really seen one. They tend to not be too explicit about what's in there. I find it hard to track, to be honest. But it's probably worth a question. See if we can get something back from that. Then Shailesh, the question about inflation. But where was the Shailesh? Was that in the report that we sent out, or was that in the charts of the slides about the inflation numbers? I think I'd assumed something like roughly about 2% per year over the next 3 years. But
maybe,
yeah.
I think it was the table where it looks at the cash and then the real, and I might have just kind of taken difference, but it might have been a simplistic way of doing it.
Yeah. It might, that might be the case, actually. I think that was the numbers I did pretty much on the day. See, what did I do? Yeah, I can't. I think I may just have used some figures that were in the budget book. I think it was 1.8%, then 2%, 2%, 1.9%, something like that. It was around 2% anyway, I think, that I'd used, which seemed a bit low at this point in time. I think we could end up with higher inflation than that, but they were the numbers that were the last ones published, I think, in the spring statement that I'd used. Yeah. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Dan, what do you reckon? I said you're looking for a splurge in accounts, aren't you?
Yeah, but I've since I've done a couple of these things, look at initial stuff, and I've asked our LGI members, for instance, when those of you who haven't published, when you're publishing them, without exception, I think they said 30th of June. So I suspect the 30th of June will be a busy day of looking on websites for that. But I noticed Martin said, I think Martin, you're saying you at Teambridge, you won't be publishing presumably for the complexity around IFRS 16. But generally, I guess, unless people say, no, we won't be publishing that, I reckon most will have published by 30th of June this year, but people are taking the time, particularly of IFRS 16, to get things straight and have a bit more time to check on their accounts before they're published. So yeah, it'll be interesting on the Friday before and that Monday. We'll get a lot of information then. But I don't expect a lot of the trends that showed you to necessarily change. Still, I reckon DSG balances will almost have doubled when everybody's published. I don't know. I've spoken to a number of people who yet to publish, said, yeah, ours have doubled, they've more than doubled. Still, it feels like they're out of control. Yeah. So that'd be interesting.
Yeah, those early results from your analysis are absolutely fascinating. But I think you're right. It's probably not going to be they're probably quite representative, aren't they, of what's actually going to
I think
happen when you
so.
see the full thing. Yeah. That's great. Sorry, I think I misinterpreted Martin's comment about the end of June. He was talking about his accounts. I thought he was talking about the consultation paper. Maybe we'll get both in the same week. Everyone's accounts and the consultation.
Bumper week.
Yeah, great. Well, unless there's anything else, we'll close up there. And okay, that's great. Fantastic. Claire, enjoy your weekend in Alston. That's where Pauline's hometown is. Enjoy your weekend. Have a good time.
I will do. Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Have a good
Thanks, everyone.
weekend.
Cheers, Dan. Thank you. Bye now.
Cheers.